Ken made a number of videos dealing with my Rejecting Sedevacantism series, and Ken's a nice enough guy. He did take time out of his life to post videos on this matter, and to him it's a very serious issue, and I believe it should be a serious issue for all of us. But what did Ken have to say in his video? Well, I'm going to try to break this down into a series of considerations, and I'm going to deal with each one in their turn. But before I do this, I want to be honest about something. I want to clarify something as well. I'm not at all convinced that Ken Bird understands the presuppositional aspect of this controversy. Now, he assures us that he does, but I really, honestly, I would disagree with him. The truth is that he isn't alone, though, when he insists that he gets it. There have been a great number of sedevacantists saying the same thing, especially on Facebook. We have to ask ourselves, do they really get it? I don't think that they do. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to break it down so that it's a little bit easier to understand exactly where this is going and where it's coming from and how this applies to the greater picture, because I do believe it applies, and I'm going to demonstrate it here. Let me break this down for you the way I did another sedevacantist on YouTube. When sedevacantists and those in communion with Rome come together, they typically exchange evidences, and these are taken from agreed upon sets of sources, be it the Bible or encyclicals or councils or creeds or catechisms, canon law, or any other source recognized by both positions to be authoritative. This oftentimes, more often than not, leads to very passionate discussions about just a great deal of issues. In fact, I don't really believe there's ever an end to this discussion if we deal with it this way. I mean, each side has its text, each side has its reasons, and each side has its own set of explanations for, not only for the world, okay, but also more specifically for why their opponent isn't buying it. They all have their own sets of explanations for that. But what's rarely discussed and considered, if in fact it's ever considered at all, is whether or not sedevacantists and those in communion with Rome are working off of the same presuppositional frameworks. Why is this so important, Jeremiah? Well, I think it's important because of what they are. We're talking about presuppositions. These are the most basic and rolling assumptions we have, and the very framework wherein our evidences are interpreted and understood and applied. So these are first things. It's very, very, very important. And before the two sides even come to the table, anytime that they come together to discuss their evidences and their theories, both sides, everybody involved, has an already existing set of ruling assumptions. These ruling assumptions, they deal with man, they deal with the world, ethics, knowledge, authority, etc., etc., etc. And when it comes to this particular discussion, I think it would do us well to consider our presuppositions regarding authority and knowledge, and more specifically, what we believe about the nature and constitution of the church, and how things are to be known and done in light of these assumptions. Consider for a moment how this plays out, and we see this all the time. It's actually relatively obvious. Take, for example, how Catholics often discuss things with Protestants. You know, Protestants are more than happy to point out where their Bibles give substance to their claims against Catholicism. Okay, they have their proof texts, we have ours, and sometimes these proof texts are one and the same. Sometimes our authorities are one and the same. The difference in all of this isn't in what could be called maybe our proximate starting points over against our ultimate starting points. I don't think that's really where it lies. I mean, let's make this a little bit more listener-friendly. I don't believe it's so much the evidence, at least the evidence in and of itself. Instead, I think it's the evidences within an overall worldview from whence these things come and wherein they make sense. To Catholics, these evidences are seen in light of beliefs pertaining to the Constitution of the Church. This Constitution provides a hierarchical framework wherein controversies are resolved and difficulties are remedied. It's for this reason that I don't really believe it's as much an either-or, like the sola ecclesia antagonists would like to say, but rather that it's an issue of both and. I think it's the agreed-upon sources in connection with a kind of final authority for the settling of disputes. So back to sedevacantism. We may agree full well on sources for the discussion, but as I said before, I'm not at all convinced that we are operating off of the same basic and ruling assumptions, at least regarding the Constitution of the Church and how controversies are to be known and resolved in light of this Constitution. The sad part of this is that apologists in communion with Rome, at least in my estimation, have allowed this dilemma to slip under the radar. And they've done so for a long time. This is long overdue to be talked about. Many of them have failed to see the causal connection between one's presuppositions concerning the constitution of the church and the conclusions of sedevacantists. This is especially true insofar as what they believe pertaining to how this needs to be handled, both for them and for everyone else in the world. Okay? This isn't just about them, it's also about everyone else claiming to be Catholic, everything else, everybody who applies. But we see this all the time. Okay? We see evidence of this very thing all the time. These conflicting presuppositions show themselves, but are rarely, at least as has been the case here, are rarely recognized as such. I mean, how often do we hear people insisting that this is a matter that must be dealt with by competent authorities? You know, there are arguments to substantiate this. I've used some of them myself. Those in communion with Rome presuppose a hierarchical constitution of the church made up of competent authorities amongst whom they may or may not be numbered. But their mode of action, even in matters rightly judged to deserve censure, differ from the sedevacantists, and they do so for good reason. The truth of the matter is that the sedevacantist does not operate under such an intellectual framework. For the sedevacantist, competency and hierarchy matter very little, at least when discussing this, and we're going to see this in a moment with Ken Bird. Individuals, admittedly so, may not be trained in dogmatic theology and in moral theology, in philosophy, in canon law, and even in church history. But as Ken would have said, all that stuff doesn't really matter. To the sedevacantists, it's private interpretation, private opinions, private judgments. These trump, bottom line. In doing so, they strip themselves and their judgment and their actions from the hierarchical constitution of the church. So let's look at how this plays out. I mean, we understand better now the way presuppositions work. Let's see how this plays out and how this touches on what he's talking about.